meet me, and then she asks me to explain to them why Latin. And I have become increasingly disenchanted with utilitarian responses. And while utility is obviously a good thing, we don't tend to treat anything else in our schools the same way we treat Latin, because we've forgotten why we actually teach Latin, and we've forgotten that maybe it changes depending on the era. We treat English like the Romans treated Latin. We don't treat Latin like the Romans treated Latin, and trying to figure out how to explain why Latin is still important to us in our English context without resorting simply to utility is the main inspiration behind this. Additionally, I also think that people should study Latin prior to going to college if possible. When it comes to the word necessity or essence, obviously there are all sorts of things you could get away without doing, right? In school. You don't have to learn Latin to survive college anymore. You used to have to, but you don't now. But I think, as Dr. Northling has also mentioned in his 2002 Logia article, necessity is probably the wrong way to argue it rhetorically, although there is a case to be made for utility as well. So I'm going to start with a few different things. I like writing, but I'm not a rhetor or an orator, so my arrangement is not going to be amazing. I'm going to flip between some different things. I'm going to start with this PowerPoint. Beginning would be nice. And I'm Luddite, so I don't remember how to enter the regular.
Go to slideshow.
That makes sense. From beginning. All right, thank you. Cool. All right. So, I'll have some advertisements for some various books that are not mine throughout that have been helpful to me in my studies. There's 6 in particular. But we'll start with this slide. Why Latin? And then at the end, I'll return to this first slide. I just make a conclusion slide, so I'll go back to the beginning. Like I said, my arrangement's not amazing. But some of these subtitles I'll want to talk about throughout and maybe conclude with. First, I want to ask you guys why Latin, put some answers on the board. You don't necessarily have to claim it as your own answer, but you can say what you've heard, why we should be studying Latin. And they have 3 erasers. I don't see markers, but I did bring some markers. I thought that might happen. So I don't know if they don't want me to write on the board, but we can go into it. So what are some reasons that you've heard we should study Latin?
It helps on the SATs.
Helps on the SAT. That is my least favorite.
That's why I said it.
And writing is not helpful.
It's the basis for most languages spoken.
Basis for most languages spoken. I've seen this argued a number of different ways. Some people say most. Some people get more specific, like Romance languages or English, since it's a hybrid language. I'm not a linguist. I can't be more precise, but it's certainly the basis for, let's say, most, or at least many, European languages. Certainly the Romance languages. It's half of English, but yes.
Because it's beautiful.
Because it's beautiful. That is less utilitarian. I'm going to put on the other side of this. Just put beauty, more transcendental answer. I looked at the advertisement for this lecture since I wrote it months ago, so I don't remember what I said. But I think I mentioned the word transcendence. Yes.
I just want to, I think it's funny. I finally managed to convince my teachers to say beauty, but now I'm trying to convince them to say grammar.
Yeah, grammar. So, grammar.
How language works.
Yeah. So that's certainly still we would call utility, but it's perhaps one of the most important utilities. I'll still put it over here for now. That's certainly one of the big three utilities.
Like scientific languages.
Scientific, so maybe pre-professional vocabulary, something like that. Or I'll just say professional vocabulary. Also, I can spell Latin, it's easy. Spelling English is hard. What is the Latin cognate? So it should be easy. Vocabulary. So, science, law, medicine. Yes.
Going along with that, it's the native tongue of the Western achievement.
Okay. So, the cultural argument. So, how do I write that? Like 2 words.
Cultural heritage.
Cultural heritage. And that's getting at an argument of Nordling and one of my professors, Dr. Eric Ellis, who focus a lot more on the cultural significance. So we'll return to this at the end a little bit, but I think that's getting at why I like Latin. Any other special utilitarian answers? Or other answers?
Trains you how to think.
How to think? I would qualify that under utility, certainly. That's another one of the very commonly argued and probably most important utilities of Latin. Yes.
They grant access to sources that are not otherwise available through translation.
All right. So a lot of people argue that we should study Latin because everything's translated. That's obviously not true. And even if it was, that's still problematic for people who are concerned about the original, right? We certainly wouldn't be satisfied with only studying the Bible in Latin, right? One of the benefits of the Reformation, as well as Erasmus' recovery of the Greek text, and obviously Luther used that to a great extent to recapture the precise meaning of Scripture without going through other languages, other vocabulary. So translation is always interpretation. That may not be important to all people for all things, but certainly Scriptures is very important.
It helps you to better grasp what the author.
Better grasp what the author is saying. Yeah. So we have not everything is translated. Not all is translated. And along the same lines, let's see, access to author on his own terms, or in his own terms. Yes.
Can I argue this should be on the other side?
Yes. I think it's probably both. A lot of these will probably.
Can you start like straddling in the middle?
Yeah. So, if you're thinking just about the technical side, its utility, if you're thinking about the implications of that, I think it's certainly more transcendental. Do you know use this? I'm going to butcher the word transcendental over and over again. I'm probably thinking more about the virtue of Latin, more vocabulary that Dr. Ellis uses. But transcendental is a catchphrase for class association. So, anything else?
About it's hard and it puts you in a elite class of people.
So,
Just put elitism.
different.
So rigor and bragging rights.
So, I would actually argue that not teaching Latin causes more elitism because it prevents people from participating in something that they otherwise would be able to. So learning Latin isn't elite, but refusing to teach your children Latin and keeping stuff for yourself or for the elite is elitist, I think. So I think it's actually the opposite. But the fact that it's hard, and I mean, this is another difficult one because it goes both directions. There's a website called Latin is Simple, right? So what do we mean by Latin is hard? We're probably talking about maybe the way we teach it and the things that we teach in particular. We don't have all the time in the world, right? We have 37 minutes in my school per day for Latin. Some of you are blessed with an hour, maybe. Very few schools today have 4 hours of Latin instruction in the morning, which was very common in previous generations, or in some places, the entire school was Latin, right? But in 37 minutes, it is hard. So the difficulty, what builds character, and maybe mental discipline, which, yeah, how to think, but also the disciplined part of it. Yeah.
One more thing that I teach my kids is that it connects us throughout history, especially church history. The hymns, the psalms, all of these things that connects us. So, but that doesn't go for the utilitarian.
Yeah, so we've got cultural heritage also includes the Christian, classical, and what we do, our Lutheran classical education. Any others? Yeah.
Just the value of language generally, that when you get to know Latin better as like a uniquely language creature, you have better access to it.
So complements understanding of language in general. That's particularly helpful for English speakers, perhaps. We are not speaking an inflected language, at least not very inflected. We have a genitive, and there's a couple other inflected things, but it's not nearly inflected as Greek or Latin. It's very syntactical, based on word order, vocabulary. So complements, improves understanding. You can ask me to say what it for some if you need to. Complements understanding of the language. And that's another one that probably bridges both utility and something more virtuous. It's the kind of being that we are, that we deal in language and number. Right, so to understand language is to help understand ourselves, who God has made us. How many of you have seen the Memoria Press, 10 Reasons to Learn Latin, Cheryl Swope? So I have that list somewhere. I'm not going to knock it. I think that what she's doing in that piece is good, right? She's pointing out some marketable benefits. But I do want to take a look at them and see how many of them fall under utility, how many of them fall under culture or beauty or something like that. So I'll return to some of her work. She wrote a lot more on Latin than most people would know. Only a couple of pieces made it into that book that Memoria Press published. Her other one was on Latin and mathematics, which is interesting. So here are hers. 10 reasons for learning Latin. Latin is the next step after phonics. So, which several of hers will fit in the same category, right? Latin provides English with a great quantity of its vocabulary. And so if you learn the English phonics, if that's even possible to finish learning English phonics, then you can begin learning Latin, a lot of other words that are much simpler to spell, much easier to use. So phonics, let's say grammar / trivial arts in general, and all that they encompass. So, and I think, by the way, that these three are probably the three most commonly cited utilities and perhaps the most important. Her next one is 1/2 of the English words come from Latin. Vocabulary goes under trivial arts. Latin provides the root words for all of the modern sciences. We have professional vocabulary. Latin trains and, missed one. Latin is the best preparation for learning any language. I'm not sure about that one. It's certainly very helpful with Romantic languages. Obviously, they came from Latin. It's helpful for English. English is half Latin. I'm not sure it's helpful for learning Finnish, or Mandarin, or Arabic, or yeah. So perhaps simply by the virtue of it does all of these things, and so some of that will help you. Probably easier if you want to learn Finnish, just learn Finnish, right? So Latin trains and develops the mind. We have mental discipline. That one's the most controversial, actually, of all of these in the historic debates. Latin is the best unit study, so it's interdisciplinary. That's a pretty good point. For classical educators, that's probably not as much of an issue because we try to make most of our education interdisciplinary, but in the public classical schools, that might be a good thing to think about. Latin is transformative, so more of the formative arguments, mental discipline. This is where she'll associate Latin in the trivium with math in the quadrivium. I'm not sure to what extent I agree with her argument there, but there probably are some similarities, at least in appearance. And then her 10th one, Latin is the mother tongue of Western civilization. So of those 10 arguments, how many were not utilitarian? Not being. Yeah, one, I think. The last one, Latin is the mother tongue of Western civilization. So her 10th argument is her only cultural argument. The other 9 are marketable benefits. Which, once again, marketable benefits are great. We need them, especially parents, right? They don't necessarily. They want to know why this is going to help their kid. That's important to be able to enumerate those things. But I'm not sure that it should be the first 9 things on the list, and then getting closer to the actual purpose of Latin being last.
And none of them are to actually translate.
Yeah, and none of them are to translate or read or hear or speak or write. Yeah, to use the language. None of them are Latin, basically.
That would be Cheryl Lowe, not Cheryl Swope. I think
Yes,
you said Cheryl
yes,
Swope.
sorry. I knew I was going to do that. Cheryl Lowe, thank you. Yeah.
She's the founder. She's the one who wrote it.
Yes, yeah. So she wrote a lot of helpful stuff on Latin, especially during a period where no one else was. She did a great amount of work in promoting classical education in Latin, especially in the Catholic variety. But yeah, thank you for that clarification.
At the root of these practical or pragmatic reasons, I think, are we not avoiding a question of why go ad fontes with anything?
Yeah, and this is a great segue to my next question. So, I mentioned earlier, why do we do this with Latin and nothing else, right? So if I ask you why history, are you going to say SAT scores? Are you going to say because it makes you better at geography? I mean, it does. Is that the point of learning history? Does it provide mental discipline? Sure. One of our opponent's arguments is going to be that any subject can provide most of these benefits. So why should you do anything with a dead language?
So I'm suddenly realizing the connections between Latin and math. Because that's what the students ask. Why are we learning this? Well, it's good for you. It's foundational. It's all of these things.
Yeah, and some of the utility probably is present in both. I think that a lot of it will be aesthetic in the end, in that the purpose of learning math versus language, or like algebra versus Latin, will probably be different still, but the utility is certainly similar. There's a lot of similarities, there's a lot of overlap, but I don't know how far I go with calling Latin the mathematics of the trivium. But it's an interesting argument. You should read it, just to see what she says. But I'm not going to spend time on that particular argument right here. So I ask you, why history? What might you say? I mean, normally, what's the thing you hear? Why do we study history?
So we don't repeat ourselves.
Yeah,
Because if you don't, bad things will happen.
Yeah, we don't repeat mistakes of the past. My professor, and currently still at school, and so I'll quote one of my professors a lot because his sayings are fresh in my mind. But he resists the progressive understanding of history as a general upwards trajectory, and so he qualifies the statement of not repeating the past by saying, well, history is cyclical, the past is going to repeat. But you can weather the storm better if you have an awareness of history, right? So that's a helpful reason for learning history. It's also a modern answer to the question, why study history? Of course, that doesn't make it evil, right? It's still a good answer. There are two other answers to the question. I heard one of them. The works of God. Yeah, so every time God gives a history lesson in the Bible through a prophet or another leader of his people, he's telling his people what he's done for them. I would say that's the chief purpose of studying history. The classical authors like to idealize. I don't know what the etymology of romanticized is, but I'm guessing it has something to do with the fact that the Romans always speak very well of themselves. We know that Cato and some of these other highly esteemed Romans were not perfect like the Romans tended to talk about them. Obviously, they were sinners. They had very different cultural expectations for things like slavery and murder, and but if you read the Roman lives, you get these very idealized models, right? So for the Roman, history was not necessarily about knowing exactly what happened. You have this tension between Herodotus and Thucydides in the Greek, where Herodotus gives you a bunch of stories, and then Thucydides tries to do things a little bit more scientifically, and both are important parts of studying history. But for the Roman, it was almost completely about practical morality, practical ethics. Here's a guy you should be like, here's a guy you shouldn't be like. And a lot of them were, here's a guy you shouldn't be like. But they did have a lot of people like Cincinnatus, Regulus, Cato, all the Catos, like 3 of them that people know, and a bunch that people don't know. Cicero. Caesar has a lot of fans and a lot of detractors as well. Obviously, they killed him, but he sometimes, especially in modernity, shown as a model, especially because he's the only true Roman Latin author. All the other Latin authors that we know were either from elsewhere or spoke a different dialect. Caesar is the only excellent example of pure Roman Latin, which is interesting. One of the reasons that people studied Caesar alongside Cicero and Virgil as the 3 models. Sometimes they throw in Ovid, and the only answer you can find as to why is because people like him. He does provide some mythology and other things, but the 3 models of language have always been Caesar for his Romanness, Cicero for his prose, his rhetoric, his statesmanship, and Virgil for his poetry. So, if you were to say why history, we wouldn't come up with this list. We would immediately talk about an actual end or purpose, but we don't do that with Latin. We don't talk about an end or a purpose for Latin. So some of the things I want to do, and I'm realizing that I thought I was going to get done very quickly, and I don't know if that's going to be the case. Because when I started out, this was a pamphlet, and anyway. So these are some of the things that I'm thinking about. The end and virtue of Latin, not simply the utility. The relationship between end and method. What you choose method-wise, the textbooks, how you teach it, is going to be based on the end. So I mentioned there were several reasons that inspired this lecture. One of them is figuring out, are we teaching Latin the best way that we can? In order to know that, we have to know what our purpose is. If it's just mental discipline, if it's just utilitarian, then maybe we're doing a great job. If the purpose is something else, then maybe we can supplement our methods and do better. The essence and accidents, or core versus election, the opponents of Latin will call it compulsory instead of core. You can see their bias in the vocabulary that they choose. Compulsory Latin versus, it's essential is core. My question that's sort of behind that line is, Luther talks about how it's ideal that everyone learns Latin, and yet he still had Latin schools and German schools. So there's a tension there. Is Latin essential to classical education? If it is, then it has to be core, right? It can't be an elective. If not, as most schools are set up where maybe you take a certain amount of Latin and then it's elective, or maybe it's elective altogether. Should we have different schools? That doesn't seem to sit right with us, right? We tend to think that we should be able to do everything at our one institution. I haven't figured out all these questions. That's probably the one that I have figured out the least is, I'm pretty sure that Latin is essential. I mean, not just become a Latin teacher and have jobs in your age. But I think it is essential to classical education. I don't know if it is the best education for every situation. Obviously, lots of people don't learn Latin. Lots of people who have been forced to learn Latin and become doctors or lawyers or whatever complain about having to have learned it, saying that they should have spent their time studying law or medicine or whatever. The interesting thing there is they may not be picking up on the benefits that they did receive in learning Latin that have contributed to the fact that they are now a successful doctor, lawyer, and so forth. But it's a good question. The benefits of Latin, utility, participation in society on different levels. What kind of being are you as an individual? Right, you're one that deals in language. Most of us are part of the Anglosphere, right? And if you're listening to this lecture, then you at least have entered the Anglosphere to some extent because I'm speaking in English, right? So for the English-speaking peoples, Latin is incredibly important. Western civilization, much broader than our nation or our linguistic sphere, right? So, once again, we want to be able to articulate the actual purpose of Latin in addition to some remarkable benefits. So, and then how to answer the question. Our tour director at our school always gives me, she always says, if you have one sentence, explain why Latin. I'm still trying to figure that out. You're like, I need at least 3. But, how to answer that question well. And I'll give a couple of options towards the end. We have 15 minutes. So, there's more we could talk about in the general intro, but fine. So, brief history on what Latin is, defining our terms. The title is a riff on Horace, who talks about how the Greeks captured the Romans, and the Greeks were arguably more philosophically inclined than the Romans. And so you had a bunch of very wise and intelligent people enslaved by a bunch of warring people, which is an interesting combination. This is why the Greek slaves were so prized for being tutors at home, because they were better teachers than the Romans could be. Right? So, captured Rome, captured her German victors. That's my riff on it. There are a lot of similarities between Rome capturing Greece and the Germans capturing Rome. So the sack of Rome, Vandals in 410, fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. The fall of the Eastern Roman Empire was much more recent. German rulers on the continent spoke Latin by the end of the century, which that's sort of what really made me think Horace in this case. We talk about English being half Latin, and it's at least that. But even German, the language from which English comes, at least on the continent, the German rulers were using Latin. They obviously thought it was much better fit for politics, better for regulating the economy and the regime. So the Germans fell in love with Latin on the continent. In Britannia, on the island, Rome had not made as much headway either in the language or in their hold on the regime. And so the German tribes that came over, the Anglo-Saxons, continued to use Anglo-Saxon language. They were not as infatuated with Latin, although they did conquer what was Roman and Latin in England. On the continent, without the regime, to keep it stable, Latin began to evolve into Romance languages. There are two things that stabilize language. One is a regime, like an empire. The other would be a canon of authors. Latin began to, classical Latin preserved by Irish monks on the island, which I did not know. After the fall of the empire, according to the British history, maybe the Oxford history of natural Latin or something like that, the Irish monks were the ones who were preserving classical Latin where everywhere else it was evolving. By the 8th century, England had become the center of classical Latin. More people are aware of that because of this guy. Alcuin, he would eventually move from England to the court under Charlemagne and promote classical Latin and classical learning during the Renaissance there. Right when he moved, I don't think he fled the Vikings, but shortly after he left, or maybe while he was leaving, there were a lot of Viking raids. I summed it up. Vikings kill all the Latin teachers. They destroy the monasteries, the places of learning. King Alfred said, well, we don't have any more Latin teachers, so let's do some English. And I think this is when many of the English epics were written down in this period. So I'm not an English major. I don't know what Beowulf was written, but I believe it's during Alfred's tenure. And then we have the Norman invasion of 1066. Revived spoken and written Latin. Most people aren't going to think of French, but they were speaking and writing in Latin. They did have some spoken French. French was one of the first Romance languages to evolve. It evolves a century or two before Italian or Spanish. But they are bringing primarily Latin back to the island, and French sort of as a spoken language, not necessarily spoken in the courts, but it will contribute to the Frenchness of Middle English. So, I didn't finish all my slides. So, Latin and the Western Roman Empire, two noteworthy authors, Dionysius Cato, who was confused for a long time with Cato the Elder. He wrote a few books of maxims called the Distichs of Cato, two-liners. These were read by almost everyone by the beginning of the Middle Ages, and especially when we get into the 9th, 10th, 12th, 13th centuries, they will basically be synonymous with your first reader, and will develop into the Catonianus Liber, Cato book, which will include other authors, but will eventually evolve into something that's on the next slide. We also have the Latin grammar of Donatus. This is a very catechetical grammar written in question and answer, deals a lot with things like the part of speech. And it's written for Romans, so this was before the fall. Then we have after the fall. We have the Latin grammar of Christian. I'm not actually sure that's on the right slide. He's teaching Latin to Greeks, so this is the first that I know of, the first Latin textbook written, basically the second language textbook written for Greek students. It's still in Latin, but it's written for Greek students. Then we have more authors added to the Krycho book. The main staple on the Christian side, because this book is going to evolve in many different ways. There are many variations, but the two staples, there's three staples really. On the classical side, you have Cato, and then you'll also have Avianus staples, Latin version of Aesop, which will be replaced by the Romulus later on. And then Theophilus, who writes an eclogue about truth and falsehood. Truth is giving various biblical anecdotes, and falsehood is giving various classical anecdotes. And then there's this rhetorical battle, and then wisdom comes out at the end, and she judges truth to be the victor. So, pretty cool. And these were basically what you did before you did any grammar in Latin. So you read all this before you studied grammar. One of the hardest questions I was asked, why should the farm boy learn Latin? So posed to me by Pastor Keyser while we were sitting in the shade at his house, smoking a pipe. And he asked, why should the farm boy learn Latin? Here's what Luther says. If such a boy who has learned Latin afterwards works at a trade, you will have him in reserved labor as a pastor in case of need. And such knowledge will not interfere with his gaining a livelihood, and will enable him to govern his house all the better. The ordinary pastor or preacher must be acquainted with Latin, which he can no more dispense with than the learned can dispense with Greek and Hebrew. So, I like that answer. Pretty utilitarian, but it's pretty cool. So, why should my boy learn Latin? Should be working on the farm? Well, because someday he might need to be a pastor. Right. And the same arguments can be made for other vocations, right? Motherhood, fatherhood, pick a vocation. This answer pretty much fits. So, then we have Melanchthon. I didn't write quotes out, but he has a couple of fun pieces in 1533. One is on the miseries of teachers, and he complains about the difficulty of teaching Latin, so it's not a new problem. And then on the study of languages, he talks about how Latin is as important, especially in theological, but also philosophical and other regards, as Greek and Hebrew. Latin was always treated as not necessarily equal to Greek and Hebrew, because the Bible wasn't written in Latin, but as equal as it could be, given that the Bible wasn't written in Latin. So, they always grouped those three languages together. Latin used to begin with prayer. This is the first English language grammar, at least the first significant one, significant enough to be preserved. So this is William Lilly's grammar. This is the beginning of his textbook. The textbook began with this prayer. For Lilly, as for Luther and Melanchthon, one of the reasons you learned Latin was to increase affordness of wit, to understand God, right? Our Savior, also meaning what He's done for us, to increase, that bountiful goodness, good life doctrine. So all of the things that we want out of our classical Christian education, Latin helps with it. So I thought it was a pretty cool prayer. I thought it was pretty cool that textbook seems to begin with prayer. I think we should maybe start doing that again. There's some schoolers. We don't have a lot of time to go into them right now, but if you want to look at, what was prescribed for some of these schools, there's an example of one in England, one in Germany, and one in America. So those are helpful. And if you want my incomplete slides later on, I can email them to you along with the paper, which is much better than the presentation because I like writing and I don't speak that often. And a slideshow. abruptly. I have a bunch of. Zoom in a little bit. I tried to catalog the debate in the early 20th century, why Latin, compulsory Latin, and I think I have 5 minutes for like 20 years of arguing. James Loeb, you've probably heard the name Loeb before, those of you who like Latin and Greek. And he started that library. Any of you know what he did for a living?
Is he a finance capitalist?
Basically, yeah, he's a banker. Yeah. So, he gives a beautiful defense of classical education and Latin and Greek. Some of it's utilitarian, some of it's not. The healthy struggle for knowledge. He doesn't do grammar translation. He doesn't like that. So when he's saying struggle for knowledge, it's not about it's just hard, but because actually learning it wearies the body but refreshes the mind. Those people argue mental discipline in very different ways. Some of them better than others. Too much election and early specialization. That's the huge debate in the early 20th century. The elective debate started really in 1817, 100 years before Charles Eliot will go through with it at Harvard. So there's a lot here. Once again, the accompanying paper goes through a lot of this. Latin is included in the sine qua non of successful life. That one's a hard one for us because, once again, most people today don't learn Latin. They seem pretty successful. But the classicists certainly think that it's essential. So Latin equips one for leisure and retirement. This is my favorite thing that he said, actually. What are my resources now that I have everything money can buy? This whole paragraph is beautiful, but you need to be able to do something other than golf when you retire. I like golfing, but it's a sad retirement if you can only play games, right? And of course, we Lutherans have a very rich chorale tradition and lots of other things that we can spend our time doing, but Latin and Greek are good companions as well. We have this book by Francis Kelsey, Latin, Greek, and American Education. He goes through a bunch of utilitarian stuff, talks about, these doctors, these engineers, and he lists a lot more professions than you might think of, who have experts who have said, this Latin education is the most important thing in preparing me for these various professions. So it's very utilitarian, but it's pretty interesting. A lot of good anecdotes. Livingstone is the most famous defender of classical education. If you don't want to look for his very rare and out-of-print book, you can print off a scan off of Archive, The Defense of Classical Education. It's hard to improve upon this, especially in the utilitarian arguments. He doesn't spend as much time on the culture in this piece. He does have other pieces on Greek, some on Latin that go a little bit more into the culture. That's a really great one. Let's see. Pick and choose here. Here's a good response to the question: why not Greek, or why Latin? Why not Greek is never the question. It's just which order do you do them in? It's the real question. So here's his answer. If you ask a Latinist why not Greek, they'll never say don't learn Greek. But why Latin first? This is Livingstone's answer. Latin at first appeals much more readily than Greek to the ordinary boy. He may change allegiance later, but at school it is generally given to Rome. The climate of Greek literature is one we do not habitually breathe. It is for that reason all the better for us. But we must grow used to it before we can fully profit by it or feel at home in its air. And this is particularly so with schoolboys who have no great passion to give an account of life and are more interested in action than thought. The trenchant moral maxims of Rome come home to us more nearly than the delicate and profound musings of Greece. Latin then stands in our education partly on linguistic grounds, partly on heroic characters and its history, on the interest of its political and imperial problems, and on the capabilities of its people for government. And it is doubly recommended because its genius is complementary to that of Greece. Rome is a nation that, more than any other, has determined the political thought and institutions of Europe. He has a lot of other great utilitarian arguments. Why can't this be done in English? That's probably the most common thing I hear. Everything's translated, right? And there's a few different ways to tackle that. You can talk about why translation is insufficient, but most people don't care, right? So here are some of his arguments. Once again, you can find this in his book, Defense of Classical Education. I highly recommend everyone read this. It's not exhaustive, but it is a really good collection of most of the talking points. Has the study of the dead languages itself any educational advantages which compensate for time spent on them? Right, he answered this question too. His most famous locus that's reproduced by Cheryl Lowe and Classical Conversations and everyone who's ever talked about. If you've heard people talk about why Latin, they're ripping off Livingstone, and half the time they don't cite him. But here's the most famous paragraph. I'll just read the bolded part. The Latin disciplined in his thought as he disciplined himself. His words are drilled as rigidly as were his legions and march with the same regularity and precision. So you have that military sort of analogy that comes up in everybody's writing when they write about the fundamentals of Latin. So he gives a bunch of his utilitarian benefits: intellectual concentration, close attention to detail, considerable logical reasoning, continual readjustment and arrangement, hard thinking, precision, not only in our use of language, but also in exacting precision from others, accuracy in language, observation and analysis, sympathy and insight, delicacy of perception. Now, the problem with utilitarian arguments is that they can all be defeated. So there's this guy that's going to come along, Charles William Eliot, president of Harvard, 1917, the year after Livingstone wrote his piece, and 100 years after the election system started in Virginia, I think. But he's going to answer a lot of these with his critiques, most of which are not particularly good, but they are rhetorically good. They're not, logically good, they're rhetorically good. Talks about, okay, well, science is now the best thing worth having. So he's pitting science against the classics on the grounds that there's not enough time to do both. So there's, we only have so many hours in the day. This is, a problem we should think about. Too many subjects, need for more electives, fewer prescriptions. He says Latin is not essential. He says it's unnecessary for religion, government, and family life, the highest human concerns. And he comes out as an Anglophile pretty quickly. The British Empire is a better example of government than the Americans, or for the American, than the Roman Empire. He also talks about how we have Shakespeare and Milton, and then he lists a bunch of other forgotten English writers and says that these are better than all of these Latin authors that everybody still remembers. So, Shakespeare, Milton, the King James, right? These are very important for our corpus of literature. But Livingstone would say they're complementary. Once again, like the Greek and the Latin are complementary, he would say that the Latin and the English are complementary. Whereas Eliot wants to pit them against each other and say, you have English, and it is a great language, so we don't really need Latin. That's his argument. Everything's translated featuring Benjamin Franklin. Right, he just quotes Benjamin Franklin saying that it's no longer necessary for knowledge, as if knowledge was the only purpose for studying Latin. Right, Livingstone quotes Heraclitus saying that a mass of knowledge does not instruct the mind. Right, so he kind of foresees everything Eliot's going to say in his case against compulsory Latin. But Eliot tries to respond to Livingstone, so it's an interesting dialogue. And there are several times where someone publishes a book and someone else writes an article in the Atlantic about it. So interesting to watch that debate go back and forth. And I know we need some time for questions, so Dr. John Nordling, right up here. Dr. John Nordling wrote a really awesome piece. I hated it the first time I read it because I was a utilitarian. And then when I stopped being utilitarian and read it again, I thought it was one of the best things I'd ever written, or I'd ever read. He struggles with this question: why can I learn Latin and everything if it translated into English? And he gives some good advice here. Essentially, he argues for the cultural heritage. One of his students, Dr. Eric Ellis, now one of his professors, I don't know to what extent Nordling inspired this train of thought in Dr. Ellis, but I see it in both of these pieces. Dr. Ellis wrote a piece that dealt with this question, and he does a couple of really cool things. One, he shows us how foolish it is to argue some of these. For instance, why study Latin? Oh, the Romance languages. Well, actually, the fact that the Romance languages exist is an argument to study Latin. It goes the opposite direction. It's not to get better at Romance languages. The fact that Romance languages are worth studying is because Latin is worth studying. They come from Latin. Anyway, he sort of reverses a lot of these in a very elegant and informative way. But then he brings us to the cultural argument, and he's pondering what is the thing that connects all of Western civilization. Ideally, we want that to be Christ. Unfortunately, many people reject Christ. One thing that is hard to reject is the language that permeates all of business and theology and philosophy and everything else that you do in life. So he identifies Latin as the thing that actually holds together all of these different, otherwise very diverse countries, right? People always celebrate diversity, but I think it's actually more interesting what unifies us, right? And Latin is that thing in the West. So he says it much more elegantly, much more beautifully. We'll be publishing on that in the future. So I encourage you to read some of Dr. Eric Ellis's writings on Latin classical education. He is Catholic, full disclosure. But I think we can learn a lot from Dr. Ellis in this regard. So, and also he was taught by Lutherans. He has friends that are LCMS Lutheran professors, so he's not hostile to us. Anyway, I'll probably watch this later and laugh at that. Questions then in the last 7-8 minutes. Otherwise, I'll keep rambling. Yes.
I just want to emphasize, you said they used to read Latin before they went into the grammar.
Yes, reading Latin was always first.
Okay. Or now, why do you think that's the case? Or why would you think that would be good?
So, why might it be a good idea? One of my friends in the room put it like this: we want careful readers, grammarians, but we want readers first. So thank you, John, for that insight. And I think that's exactly true. We don't want to create people who are good at solving Latin puzzles on the board, but they are no good at actually using the language. If we, and I guess this is the answer of why Latin, so we can read Latin. This is so there's the purpose, the virtue, and then the benefits, right? The purpose of learning Latin is to know Latin. Just speak it, read it, compose it. That's the purpose of studying it. The virtue of it, that access to our heritage, is that thing that binds Western culture together, right? It's very fabric. And then the benefits, right? You can enumerate some nice marketable benefits, like its trivial advantages in grammar, professional vocabulary, mental discipline. Yes.
All right, so what can help us do that the best?
Yeah, so I haven't written that
in the
yet.
classroom, like curriculum wise, or what have you chosen to do in class to try to help your students?
So the single most beneficial thing that I have done, which was done at the advice of another friend of mine from the University of Dallas, and a much better Latinist than I am, but he told me to go through some of the Vulgates with my students. They already know the text, especially if you choose a pericope that was just read in church. They know what it's going to say. So when they read it, they have to spend less time on solving a puzzle and more time on actually experiencing the language. So we're afraid sometimes to do these interlinear or side-by-side things, but actually the ancients did that all the time. We have this idea of the Latin school. Half the Latin schools did a lot of vernacular stuff. We tend to forget that. So when you're trying to learn a language, especially if you're programmed like a Wheelock program where they just throw a sentence at you, they make you decode it, that's good for a lot of things, but it's not good for just reading the Latin. So practice reading. I mean, you can't get better at language without doing language. So practicing the reading, and yeah, an excellent way to do that is with the Vulgate. It's also fairly accessible Latin. So that would be my recommendation for improving Latin. one of the next things I want to investigate is, can we bring back some of this, like Liber Catonianus stuff, these old school readers? Can we get our younger children to be reading Latin prior to studying the grammar? I think it's probably possible, but it might require more sacrifice than most teachers and parents are maybe willing to put forth, because it is obviously time intensive. Once again, 37 minutes versus 4 hours to your entire school day. It's not the same.
Yeah, we're also done in 3 years though.
Yeah.
Oh, that dovetails into my question. When do you guys start Latin instruction at the school?
We start 3rd grade officially, and then we go down. Our 3rd through 5th Latin teacher also goes and teaches the kindergartners, 1st grade, 2nd grade, but officially 3rd grade. Yes.
So I've heard multiple sides to this. I want to get your opinion. So when is a good time, if any, I've heard that you should continue with Latin, stick with it, and that's the only language, other language besides your. So when personally, I would say high school to switch out and say you have your foundation, hopefully by that point, to go and switch out maybe to Greek or Spanish or whatever. So when do you think would be a good time to do a different language that you already have the basis in Latin for?
So you have a different answer in every single era because the situations are different. The Romans actually wanted their kids to learn Greek first because they're going to learn Latin anyway. Right? People are speaking Latin. So they had them learn Greek formally first and then Latin to fill in. Tolkien and Lewis learned Latin at school. They studied English on their own. We know them as English authors, but that was actually not what they were trained to do. They were trained in Latin and they studied English on their own. A lot of the older Latin schools will say switch to Greek in what we would call secondary education. They had a much better foundation of Latin than most of our students do, which is the difficulty. So I would prefer my students stay in Latin probably through 12th grade in my context. But obviously, we don't want to prevent them from learning Greek, right? Especially when they're interested, that should not be wasted. Some of our students try to do both at the same time. That's pretty impressive. There are benefits and difficulties that come with doing both at the same time. Yeah, it depends on the situation. So I don't know if I can describe when the ideal time to switch to Greek is, but any Latins should say that you should study Greek after Latin. Some of the Greek guys might say you don't need Latin at all, but yes.
I've heard the argument that Greek should be given primacy just because that is the language of the Bible, and the Bible has primacy. How is that viewpoint necessary?
So, Latin was often associated with studying grammar. We even studied English grammar on Latin terms like subject, nominative, right, and verbum, verb. In the Tower of Learning, you have grammar in the basement, and as you proceed through, you get to theology. And a lot of the stuff in the trivial arts are associated with Latin historically, and then philosophy and theology are often associated with Greek or Hebrew with theology as well. There are also practical difficulties of neglecting Latin and going straight to Greek. Some of them, you can overcome basically all of the difficulties, but they are there. Things like the alphabet's different. The things they write are different. Romans are much more interested in action and stories. Greeks are interested in thought, and it's hard to get a junior high boy interested in philosophy right away. So there are a lot of practical benefits to studying Latin first that I wouldn't want to try to teach Greek first unless it was a very specific context. Like I have a Greek-speaking friend who started teaching his son Greek first. He also speaks Latin fluently. It depends on the context, but I think that the practical benefits for Latin first heavily outweigh the any advantages that might be gotten by skipping Latin. So.
All right. Any other questions you have for him? We'll have to save, or you can come and bother him afterwards. So thank you.